Okay, well, thanks everybody for staying with. One just a note from the uh, the the loss that I had. That meant some of you I know had given me questions, either my fellow panelists in the chat room or Q&A. I think they're being captured and sent to me, but I just want to encourage anyone who I didn't have a chance to give a live response to, if you'd like to email me, be perfectly happy to engage in a conversation with you that way, because I lost the live interaction there. But what we're going to do for a while, and I think Stefan has made his apologies. I think he was feeling under the weather.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. So I think, Marcus, you're logged in, aren't you? I thought I saw Marcus. Are you with us?
Marcus was there, but video gone off. Yeah, kind
Just
of from me also to all the attendees, because I couldn't manage to respond to the live questions. So please feel free to contact me by email. Yeah.
Okay, but I think Marcus, you are on audio. I saw you on video for just a moment, but now I can't. There you are.
Marcus is now changing to audio only.
Okay.
His internet connection is not very good.
Okay, just wait, Marcus, just say hello when you're back. What we did was I invited the invited speakers to submit some ideas for discussion, and I got some, we got some good ideas. The organizers also had a few ideas, and we kind of glommed them together, and I threw some points out to the invited speaker panel to think about. But we don't necessarily, I think we'd be very happy to also entertain questions from or contributions from our the other speakers, and also via the chat channel and the Q&A channel from anyone in attendance. So don't really want to make this just a conversation among just four of us. And also I invite my fellow conference organizers to also jump in as they see fit. So I hope you've all been enlightened and getting used to all this virtual conference stuff. So I think and I'm gonna have to look off to the side to read the question. I think maybe one way to put some of what we've been doing together is something that actually emerged from a point that David brought up when we asked for contributions, and it's a sort of a methodological question. So I'll read what I sent out to the panelists. And again, we can certainly invite contributions from other people. Although this is true of all studies in emotion, what can we be most confident about in capturing either emotional decoding or reaction to music via, and here are the three things we've all used: verbal report of some kind, answering a survey, answering whatever, physiological and neural measures. So we've had a number of presentations where we had brain measures, or we had skin conductance, etc. And C, we've also had some actual sort of behavioral studies as well, where people were doing memory tests or whatever, perceptual tests. So we have those three kinds of things. And the prompt is, what holes can be poked in relying on each of those methods to study emotion, which is notoriously hard to capture? And are those holes large enough to risk sinking the ship? So
well, if you ask for my one penny of thought, I believe always that anything with the emotions, especially related with the musical emotion, the moment if I ask, or if participant had to verbally report or explicitly, it contaminates. So it's without a doubt, it contaminates. And so I myself done this kind of research, but I always take it with a large pinch of salt, because usually often, especially with the music primarily, when we do not think about emotions, when suddenly we feel that we get moved. So this aspect that the moment you have to ask, we have to give a rating, how much I like 1 to 7 scale and others, it doesn't matter whether you are relying on behavior or whether you are trying to link with the neural. Neural has its own lot of baggages. And then whether you try to link with it, I am not too confident whether you're relying on neural, behavioral, autonomic, psychophysical, blah, blah, blah. But the moment if I ask verbal, it has a huge baggage in my view. The moment if I don't ask and see how the participants behave and respond in a way that is already indicating that he or she has been moved or experiencing particular emotion, that finding, in my view, has hitting or targeting a much more core aspect rather than, okay, getting verbal labels, whether all possibles. I mean, I know research is kind of scattered. That's a usual route we all adopt. But in my view, there's a serious limitation. That's my kind of penny of thought. Okay.
So just to clarify, A, B, and C, behavior and physiological, but not verbal report.
Well, I have got reservations, all three.
Right,
So,
but
okay.
what you just said refers...
Because the neural also is a huge problem with the neural. There's a problem with reverse inference. And even if you, for example, neural, you can get neural as well as psychophysiological. You can get responses, significant responses, even if you don't get verbal, or the vice versa. Or you can say, oh, if I get a correlations with the verbal, that doesn't mean much.
I'm just clarifying whether you're separating verbal report like on a scale with a behavior like a memory test.
What I would say, I would put a fourth option to have a better experimental design. There, when we are putting the emotion at the background, the effect of emotion, rather than participants thinking about it, rather participants doing something else, and then from the task, from their performance pattern, we could have a reasonable idea that what are the underlying experience, subjective emotional experience participant has. So in a sense of, I would put more stress on having an experimental design when the experimenter is not explicitly making emotion at the foreground. That's my approach, or I would have a more confidence in those kind of findings.
Others?
Andrea, I could add something there. First of all, I basically agree with what Joy just said there. I think humans are great storytellers. So we always like to sort of couch what is going on in terms of some sort of story. And I think when we have emotions and when we ask people to talk about what they're feeling and so on, there's an enormous potential here for confabulation. So I think that people can feel things and have really no insight into why they're feeling them, but nevertheless feel compelled to create a story that explains what's going on. So I think self-report is very, at least in my experience doing research, has been very, very open to confabulation. That's not to say that the stories aren't interesting, because then you can start asking, well, why did they confabulate in this particular way? Why did they spin out this kind of story as opposed to some other kind of story there? And just to reiterate, all of these methods, none of them are sterling. I think if we go back to some of the original ideas behind emotions, of emotions as motivational amplifiers, that what emotions do for us is that in the presence of an emotion, we're more apt to behave in a particular way than in the absence of that emotion. And so to the extent that emotions are these amplifiers for behavior, I think the most useful ones are behaviors, overt behaviors, where a person makes a choice of some sort, or stands up or sits down, or there's some action that one can measure as a dependent measure that's probably been motivated by the change of affect that's hopefully been induced. But I agree, there's no magic bullet here, and I become quite skeptical of a lot of self-report.
Marcus?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that there's definitely no magic bullet. I think in a lot of areas of psychology, we find ourselves with lots of different tools at our disposal to investigate the phenomenon that we're interested in, but none of those tools is perfect. All of the tools have flaws, and I think often it's the case that we can get a better understanding of the phenomenon by kind of triangulating, by using different tools with sometimes complementary disadvantages and advantages. So I think there's great benefit in doing that in lots of areas of psychology and in music psychology too. One thing I think when we're, well, perhaps with emotion, but especially I think with aesthetics, I think the the subjective experience really is at the heart of the phenomenon. I think that there are lots of things that we look at in music psychology where we can kind of get away from the subjective experience for the reasons that Dave and Joy noted. But I think with aesthetics, it's hard to get away with, get too far away from the subjective experience. But I think as long as we do that triangulation, looking at the phenomenon from lots of different angles, using different methods, then I think we can get a better perspective on it.
And I guess I'm a little bit of an outlier. I'd like to put in a word for verbal reports, where I've grown actually more confident in at least some aspect of verbal report. And I think that also goes back to maybe the age-old question of, can we even say someone's had an emotion if they're not giving the verbal report? At least when I was learning about emotion way back, that was kind of one of the truisms, and I sometimes come back to that. And I think that's a little bit in reaction to some studies, not of the people mentioned here, that I have seen some studies we all have, where somebody's doing skin conductance, and because the needle goes in a certain direction, they automatically say, oh, that person was frightened. And that's an extreme non-use of verbal report that I think has been sometimes detrimental to our field.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and I'm a little bit more favorable towards verbal reports in certain circumstances, partly to capture individual differences, but only, of course, when we use the highest standards of, as best we can, getting scales that are valid and reliable. And if we're doing qualitative coding, we do all our best practices for that as well. So I think I'm maybe a little bit more on the other side of that boat, even though I didn't used to be.
No, I am with your side as well. I'm not telling verbal report is not useful. It's absolutely useful. And to be honest, there has been a recent study which showing that the verbal report correlates with correlates with an action much more than the task performance. And also David says the verbal report is primarily, it's a manifesto because we are an excellent storyteller. So this is a kind of fantastic interesting question, why the participants express feeling in that way, although they might not have clear insight into their feeling. My point was primarily, if we want to understand the nuance of our emotional flux, then verbal report might not give you the full capture. Surely, if you ask that what is the overall trait related aspects, but if you're looking at a very much finer grained information, which is emotion is very transient, very short lasting there. And also another one, which I think also quite related, because emotions, the way we treat, it's a very much binary, categorical, but it is not practically. And it is much more difficult if something is much more complicated, diffused in actuality, but it's much more difficult to represent that linguistically. Because linguistically, semantic differential, we can always go with one category over another there. However, actually, this might be in the emotional space, in the whatever abstract space, this could be much more weighted combination of various emotions. And those aspects of these different subtle nuances of the different weights of the different dimensions, it will be quite difficult to capture verbally, or also to express that in verbally.
Andrea.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Somebody was asking me something.
Oh, Andrea, can I pick up on a point that Marcus made that I think is important? I think you're absolutely right that the subjective experience of the quality of the emotion is really central, especially when we're talking about music. I think one thing that might be helpful as a discipline, some people are clearly better in touch with their emotions than other people. And so it would be nice if we had some really good instruments for evaluating the reliability of different participants in terms of their introspective accuracy and reliability. That would help a lot, I think, in sort of sorting through a lot of self-report issues, because, and especially in the case of music, there really are people who seem to have a lot more insight into what it is that they're experiencing. It would be nice if we had some tools to help us identify those people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm picking up on questioner that's asking about timing issues, reaction times, and asked if that could be a measure. When I was framing the question, I kind of put reaction times as a behavior, but I think that picks up a point that some of you were making, that how we feel about this might depend on whether we're interested in the moment emotion, or if you will, the cumulative mood, which almost by definition what requires you to be out of the moment because it's a longer term kind of assessment. And so the time course of what we're interested in might also help determine.
Yeah, which is absolutely right. I mean, this is only very recently, there are some scant evidence investigating the temporal structure of emotion as the music unfolds. Because traditionally, we always give a happy music, sad music, just a one tag, but that's not how it is there. So how as the music dynamically unfolds and how it also leads to the kind of changes in emotions, the time course, to be honest, we only started looking at it quite recently. Otherwise, the research so far earlier, most of the research are only tagging, okay, both from the psychologically, also from the this music information retrieval community, which is a huge community. They're trying to understand the musical emotions, but they're just giving one tag. Oh, this is a positive, happy music, sad music. But that's, again, a very crude representation.
And maybe as the attendees are listening, if they think of something from anybody's talk or a poster that they thought was a good kind of example of kind of using a technique that that was robust enough so that the ship wouldn't sink, you can contribute that, and we can throw that on the table as well. And I think, of course, we all have to be sensitive to some of the recent critiques about neuroscience studies that are sometimes overinterpreted in the absence of any context. We've all seen, I'm sympathetic to some of those, that anytime you put a brain image up, people seem to think you've reached the ultimate in explanation, when clearly you need to have the context.
I just mentioned, since you mentioned, although being a cognitive neuroscientist myself, just have to shoot at my feet. There, just today, there is a paper came out, the same neuroimaging data set, fMRI data set, same data, identical data set, analyzed by 70 odd different laboratories. They come up with the 70 odd different findings. So just to show there's a problem with dealing with a complex data set. It's not just whether dealing with a complex subjective, whether emotion is also quite complex, but even the neural data, which is quite enormously complex, and there are so many degrees of freedom involved. So one has to be always careful, on top of reverse inferencing, that the results are not always quite consistent across labs. It just came out. It will be published next week, Nature. These findings that the same data set analyzed by different lab of their own processing pipelines, they come up with quite different outcomes. That shows the problems, inherent problems dealing with, I'm not saying this is a problem of neuroscience, this is a problem of dealing with any complex data set or any complex construct, including emotion itself.
All right, well, why don't we leave the, sorry, go ahead.
Andrea, I was going to just pick up on that brief conversation about timing or the temporal component. I think it's something that's, Mari Rees-Jones would probably say this, it's our neglected dimension, really. And I think there's been a real neglect here. We tend to think of, we make a distinction between emotions, moods, and temperaments in terms of the timing there. And these things are actually important. If you think of, if you have a pain, for example, and you go to your family physician, they'll ask you whether it's a dull pain or a sharp pain. And they have different temporal components to them, but they also point to different types of processing. And that serve different purposes. And one thing that I think we've really not paid much attention to is the different temporal frames that go on with music. One of the difficulties in studying it is that the qualia changed so dramatically in such short periods of time. And I think, the work that Marcus does is on such a fine-grained temporal aspect to it. And we don't have any really good theories about why some things happen at particular time scales, and probably not the best tools for really dealing with time. I think we probably ignored these to our detriment.
And I've been thinking about that recently, because when I showed you that study with Emery Schubert, we were using a mouse that was getting 2 measurements per second on a valence and arousal 2-dimensional space, and in another study too was a 1-dimensional emotionality scale. That was pretty fine grained, but for various reasons, for the one that I told you about is in progress, we're only getting those every 5 seconds. And yeah,
There's a
we
lot
kind
happens
of
in
lose some of the temporal, but there were some reasons for that as well. So I hear you. I'm definitely thinking about that. I think maybe we should, I did get a comment that I just want to throw on the table, that one of our attendees does note, of course, that self-report, like other things, it has to be weighed very carefully when you're doing any kind of cross-cultural. And I would add, if it's verbal report, cross-language. You don't even have to go cross-cultural. The auditory imagery scale that I use and invented in English, I've dealt with some very interesting translation problems, including with Leah for going into Hebrew, and even in closely related languages, it's quite nuanced about how you do the translation, then you compare the back translation, even in your shared culture, but a different language. So I know those are something that we all also have to keep in mind when we go across language or cultural communities, the self-report issue. So very good point that somebody brought up. I'd like to move maybe to one of our other questions. And I had said, I'd sent out the theme of this conference specifically involved emotion as one of the components of this quartet. But to what extent do you think that musical experience must involve emotion directly? Can it be can music, like other art, be just purely understood? Or can it just be communicated at a cognitive, perceptual, or symbolic level? Or does that even involve a second order emotion, like you're successfully understanding, so you take pleasure at that? So I know that's a little bit of a rabbit's hole, perhaps, but do any of you have any thoughts on that? And again, inviting anyone else in the audience to contribute a thought as well.
I can say something here. I hope I don't dominate the conversation, but I think there's one affective component that's sort of necessary, and that's pleasure. So sometimes music can be exciting to us. It can be educational to us. It can we can appreciate it because it insults us or challenges us. But if music didn't partake of some element of pleasure, it would cease to play much role in human affairs. So I think there's at some level, whatever level, there's got to be some attraction to it. And so I think if there's no pleasure there, there probably is going to be no music making.
Yeah, I mean, that's possibly with anything. I think otherwise it will be very difficult to justify why you should keep investing so much time if that activity or the listening, making, doing together doesn't engage or doesn't produce certain pleasure at subjective level there. However, the question you ask, Andrea, that's possibly much more fundamental. Okay, I mean, it's a more fundamental whether music itself can be understood without having an emotion. But I think going back to your own comment when you're presenting, you're telling, can it be possible to music without having any emotion? So that's a possibly more fundamental research question, that whether emotion is a first order derivative or is it a derivative out of first order processing there. So that's, I do not know, to be honest there. Only I can just echo what the David says. So whether, I can only say this is a necessary component in order for us to keep us engaged with it for a long period of time. If we do not get any kind of pleasure in whatever quantity or whatever utility value, then it will be very difficult to, I could not think of anything that we still partake, which doesn't provide us any utility of any sort, and that we do that over a continuous period of time.
Although, to echo something Marcus said, that could be more of aesthetic rather than emotional. I don't get any particular emotion, I just like it. I think, Leah, you had a comment.
Yes, I wanted to just pick up something that you said about comparing to other arts. I mean, I like to look at a picture or a sculpture because I enjoy it. The enjoyment can be either direct or secondary to the fact that it's interesting, that I can learn something, it's intriguing. I think that in music it's the same. Sometimes music can evoke pleasurable emotion, but it can also be intriguing. And I like the intrigue. I like this emotion. I like to be intrigued. I like to be interested. So I think it's similar to other art.
Mm-hmm. Marcus, did you have something on that?
I think both things are possible. I think if I think about the way that I listen to music, at some points I will listen to music intellectually as a kind of cognitive puzzle. At other times I'll listen to music in an emotional way. And I also think people vary in the extent to which they do these things. There's some people I think enjoy music primarily as an intellectual pursuit. Other people are very much emotional responders to music. So there are probably some individual differences, but also some differences in terms of the context within which one is listening to music.
And I think there also might be a different perspective when you're performing the music. So we've with some exceptions in this conference, we've mostly talked about consumers of music, and only a few people have talked about the producers of music. And I think maybe that's an interesting, so we had, when we talked about flow, certainly those were producers of music, but that might vary. I think some of you are active performers or have been, I am. And I can see that sometimes that's intellectual before I can get the emotion out of it. I have to know how to produce that. I'm a choral singer. And I remember in university working on the Webern Cantata No. 1, my introduction to 12 tonal music. And it was very intellectual till we put it together and then we could hear it. But we got pleasure out of it. And I'm afraid there was some schadenfreude involved when we got so frustrated because we thought we weren't doing it well. And the director put on a professional recording. It was Pierre Boulez. And he knew what we'd react to because there's a wrong note in there in that recording. And we picked it up and we were so proud of ourselves, and that made us feel better about it. And that was kind of a second order. So he was very smart. He knew what our reaction would be.
Just a point of clarification about pleasure. There's not one form of pleasure. There are an awful lot of them.
Yeah.
And, you know, people could take pleasure out of a sense of social identity, you know, attractiveness or attention to it. And so I just, you know, I think there's a huge sweep of possible sources of pleasure.
Yeah, so that's usually the limitation of the language. You use the one word, but there are various roots.
Yeah.
And often we are not very, also being mindful about which root we derive the pleasure. We are only aware of the final, the kind of pleasurable feelings, but we are not very mindful or being aware of by what roots we get the pleasure out of it.
But I think you're kind of sort of agreeing that we need not necessarily feel a specific emotion. There's pleasure, but we don't necessarily need to feel an induced emotion or even hear an emotion in the music. Are you kind of sort of agreeing with that?
I mean, are you asking me, Andrea, or
anybody?
Well, I would then first ask, what do you mean by the pleasure? What is the definition of pleasure? What is the definition of emotion? Okay, then once we have a clear boundaries, okay, then we can say that whether it is possible to feel pleasure without experiencing an emotion.
Yes, emotion, like I feel sad, I hear that it's angry, I hear that it's funny.
Yeah, but these are again, okay, Andrea, just a language level we are using it. This is again, I always consider this as the kind of limitation constrained by the language. Okay.
Marcus?
I do think it's important to distinguish between pleasure and experiencing an emotion. In that, you know, it's perfectly possible to experience the full range of emotions and find all of them pleasurable in various contexts. So David made this point, I think, yesterday. You know, one can experience sadness in listening to a piece of music and find that pleasurable. So it's important to distinguish between those two things. But I think the emotional, the feeling of an emotion would not be a necessary component of the response to music. But as David says, I think the aesthetic component, the pleasure really is a necessary part of it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have something that we call music.
And I've been struck by one emotion we never seem to talk about. I'm not going to say anything, very negative here. Actually, the opposite. We almost never talk about humor.
David does.
Yeah, David can talk
with
about
some
that.
exceptions, but generally speaking, the community, and that's not necessarily confined to the music emotion community, but it's one of the emotions we simply talk about less often, but it's something that are such an important part of people's lives, and certainly composers have made us laugh, and sometimes very deliberately, like the whole PDQ Bach and parody tradition, which I still find hysterically funny, but even more subtly. And it's kind of curious, we don't see more studies with humor involved.
There's a study with Caitlin Trevor about, so the opposite of the inducing humor would be the representation of something like laughter. And so there is a paper by Trevor about are humoresques humorous? And so one of the things that happens with laughter, and what she does is measure laughter, this ha 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 ha, and she looks at musical humoresques and actually shows that they tend to use staccato in a way that emulates the kind of punctuated vocalization that is associated with laughter. So apart from the issue of inducing laughter or amusement in listeners, there is a repertoire of music which emulates some aspects of laughter. But the important point to say here is that this is a very tiny repertoire. There's not very much music that tries to emulate amusement, apparently.
And I certainly quite enjoyed performing some PDQ Bach. For those of you who don't know him, the imaginary 21st child of JS, and I was privileged to sing his madrigals, The Queen a Royal Pain Doth Give, and My Bonny Lass She Smelleth. And I was in the chorus for his opera Oedipus Tex. It was very moving. That was very funny. So, okay, lots of good thoughts. Let me move on maybe to something else. And let's kind of go beyond maybe exactly what we all talked about, but I'm sure everyone who publishes on this topic and goes to conferences is frequently is challenged by this. And the way I phrased it to the panel was, the general public is sometimes led to believe that music can be a help with many, and I put in parentheses, all, problems, from enhancing thinking. We're not even going to mention the Met side effect here, to ameliorating physical and mental disabilities and beyond. To what extent, though, does the current literature really support the link among these areas? And I know I got a question a little bit about this in my talk. Link among these areas is providing insight and guidance into therapeutic, and I'm using that term very broadly, therapeutic uses of music. Is anything we've talked about here the last few days give us some insights into therapeutic?
Okay, who wants to go ahead? Okay, I mean, okay, if I give again my simple thoughts, okay, yeah, I mean, I don't know, the music and well-being now is a hot topic. There's a lot of research going on there. What I would say, that yes, it has a potential without a doubt there. Can it solve everything? No. Even for many things, for example, I can give my kind of experience, practical experience. Now, for example, music is used as relaxations. In the YouTube, you have hundreds of thousands of musical excerpts, helping relax, helping focused attentions, different types of rhythmic entrainment. There are certain neurobiology underlying it. So it's a big industry, actually. It's a cottage billion-pound, billion-dollar industry. How to use music to enhance relaxations, enhance concentrations, focus, well-being, using different binaural beat, monaural beat, using the entrainment. And once we tried systematically study in the lab to look into the more of the, not just to see whether it helps relaxation, but look at the underlying neurobiological mechanisms. And then we found that the relationship, although hundreds of people said very positive things on the, if you go to the YouTube comments and others, they have, some of them are viewed or listened to more than 100 million times. It's a huge amount there. But what we found, when you do the more of a controlled laboratory research, it's not that straightforward, just like most of the things in science. The effect, first of all, even if effect size are quite small there, considerable individual variations, which makes it more interesting. Doesn't mean that doesn't one size fits for all there. But this also casts a serious doubt that many of the commonly held belief that, so where that how much really they are supported by empirical data there. So because we do research, and sometimes with companies, they're interested to really look into the more of a rigorous settings there, and there we found that many of the claims don't stack up there against the data there. And that makes it interesting from our point of view. So because science is not just getting a null finding, makes it more interesting that why there are variations. If there are variations, means there are more individual, if there is, as we talked quite a bit about individual differences, and that's where our understanding is pretty limited. And especially regarding the music, we all have our idiosyncratic associations. So from that point of view, yes, it has a potentials, okay, there, but empirical data, I would still say, quite thin yet so far.
Okay, Marcus or David?
Go ahead, Marcus, if you want.
Area of expertise, but what I think I would like to comment on is not so much therapeutic applications of music, but the research on the effects of music, either musical listening or musical training, on cognitive abilities beyond music, where I think that there's a lot of interest and excitement there, but actually the effects are, to the extent that they do exist, are often very small. So sometimes they're significant, but sometimes they're usually pretty small, and they're almost never causal. They're correlational effects comparing musicians and non-musicians. And one of the things that occurs to me with this literature is that, well, I think for me, music is interesting as an object in its own right, and it doesn't. The idea that we can sort of justify music somehow by looking for its effect on IQ or other kinds of psychological or cognitive.
Okay.
Did we just lose Marcus?
Yeah, got frozen, yeah.
No, he's fine, I think. Are you alive, Marcus? Yeah, I know he has some, so internet's a little iffy. So Dave, jump in for a minute, and then we're just so I can let you know, I've been asked to wrap up in about 5-6 minutes so we can let audience throw us some things. I want to get to that question 4 ever so briefly.
So just to pick up on the theme that Marcus had already started there, I think we all want music to be all that music can possibly be, and to the extent that it can help with human well-being in any way, shape, or form, I think we're all eager to embrace that. But I think the evidence is pretty strong that our expectations are well beyond what the evidence suggests. Glenn Schellenberg has done, as you probably know, a number of papers that really pull the rug out from a lot of claims that people have been making there. And also just on, since I'm a musicologist, on the music side more directly, I think we have a bit of a problem with the current enthusiasm of the last 10 years or more of what's called in the area applied musicology, or you find it in applied ethnomusicology and so forth. The idea that graduates of programs and so on can go out and essentially act as kinds of social workers, extending the therapeutic benefits to more social kinds of things. And there, the problem is that in a world in which evidence-based research is really de rigueur here, we're way behind here. I think that social workers themselves have had lots of experience of things that intuitively make sense when they've finally been properly evaluated, finding that these things don't work at all, or it can be, in fact, the reverse of what your goals are. And unfortunately, in music scholarship and musicology, people are not trained about how to do program evaluation or any of these things. And I think we're destined for a very big fail and a very big problem with the applied musicology movement, there's a lot of great intention there and very little research suggesting that the effectiveness of any of these things, and that's a sad situation.
Yes, and I will, I've been so pleased to see several of the posters and papers being very careful about their control conditions, but that is not necessarily always true out there. And I think some of these exaggerated claims are not only small effect sizes, they don't have the control conditions. So I put out a paper recently. You don't have to read the paper. This is what the title is. You know what it's about. Are musical autobiographical memories special? ? It ain't necessarily so.
Mm-hmm.
And when we use the right control conditions, I know it's a great title, what can I say? You don't have to even read it, you know what we found. And the control conditions need to be very strongly matched. So I think that's something that has, and particularly in the emotion part of music psychology, has been a bit lacking in some spheres. So just so we can close out our kind of little exclusive club and open up more, just very quickly, I'd ask the panelists, if this conference were to reconvene in the future, yay, can we all go to Canterbury? But adding a fifth circle, we'd have to redesign the logo, of course, but what would you add? Where would you like to draw your next collaboration from? Just short answer, what fifth circle in your personal design, either for everybody or your personal redesign of the quartet into a quintet?
I can get it started with a short answer, culture. So I think what would be nice is to be able to reach out to the anthropologists and the ethnomusicologists in some way that would at least start a conversation and bring us all into the fold.
Very good, yes. Marcus?
Yes, this is just related with David, self and society.
Culture and society, okay.
No, not culture, society, self and society.
Self and society, okay.
There.
So you would add that to the circle?
Because music is inherently personal, the way we consume, but at the same time, it is socially contextualized. Evolutionary, it is contextualized.
But who would your collaborator be? Would you want a sociologist on your team? Is that what you're saying?
Well, we have no, not really, sociologist, okay, there. Okay, I don't want to go into that right now, okay.
Yeah, so the circle has to I'm kind of getting into like who would be in your circle kind of thing.
So there is a considerable body of social psychologists, okay, who are quite actively engaged.
Social psychologists, not sociology.
Exactly, social psychologists, we can learn from each other.
Excellent. Marcus?
I have two, actually. We're going in different directions. Can I have two?
Yes, go ahead, Marcus. I suggested two. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The first is performance. Since as you mentioned, Andrea, we've focused on perception to some extent, or experience of music. So I think performance would be a good one to add, and maybe also evolution, to bring in a more kind of biological side.
Mm-hmm. I agree with these. I was going to add performance as my circle, and two kinds of performers I would like to bring closer into my circle. I think absolutely fascinating, and those would be conductors, who I've been very intrigued by for a while now, as kind of bringing together a number of the things that we all talk about, but having to both integrate and both to synthesize, to be both splitters and clumpers in the conveyance of everything, including emotion, and composers. I think would be very, very interesting to bring into the circle, as again, having to convey in different ways than the performer does. and the audience member. So I might add those two in particular into my performance circle. Okay, I think I've been asked to open the floor. I think Amir is going to curate some questions that we've had from our attendees, and of course, fellow panelists, feel free as well. So Amir, you want to say some things?
So one is a response to the panel, and I also agree with them. So they say there's no technique that singularly will not sink the ship. The problem is that the ship can't accommodate several techniques simultaneously. If you gain a spatial resolution, you lose temporal resolution. If you gain subjectivity, you lose objectivity. If you gain external validity, you lose internal validity, and so on. We are all in the same storm, but in different boats. So I think that's a very reasonable comment. Okay, so let's begin with this question. What are your thoughts about the James Lange theory of emotion? And also, on the other hand, we have Russell's 1980 valence arousal model and Watson and Teleghen's 1985 positive activation, negative activation that break emotions into two dimensions of arousal and valence. Are we not oversimplifying emotions? Can we rely on these models to basically describe emotions?
So, anyone want to take that?
Okay, I'll just give the last, okay, because there's quite a few. I think the big questions, David, you can take it. Okay, there. I will just say the last one, this whether oversimplification. Absolutely, we are oversimplifying. And that's what science is all about, reductionism. So, okay, so we reduce the problem, a complex problem, into a much more, very, very simplistic one that we can rigorously control for, although the actual reality this is much more complicated than that. So without a doubt, emotion is way more than two dimensions, no doubt about that. There is already some, even in the musical domain, there are some extension to, for example, this model by GEM model, which is Geneva emotional model, kind of extending 2 to 9, although this has this own link, kind of semantic labels. Last year, there is a PNAS article which suggested there are, I think, 13 dimensions there. So you can come up with the X number of dimensions. That's possibly not that entirely relevant. But what is relevant as a practicing scientist, that whatever the model we can work with, we should have a reasonable, because it's very much based on the hypothesis testing there. So it is any model that we can start with, at least that gives us the opportunity to rigorously control and manipulate so that we can establish a cause and effect relationship. So yes, short answer is we are oversimplifying without a doubt there. But this oversimplification also has a lot of advantages, the way we do science. But at some point, we have to add further, we have to go further. How can we get a better picture from a very high dimensional object to a two-dimensional projections there? So that's definitely interesting problem that at some point we have to encounter there. But otherwise, personally, I completely agree with you. We are oversimplifying there, but these are oversimplifying for purely pragmatic, practical reasons, so that whatever the data that we generate in the lab, we can confidently interpret and clarify and establish a cause and effect relationship.
If I could just add a postscript to what Joy just said, I would say it as follows. We simplify problems not because we believe them to be simple, but because we believe them to be complex.
And
Excellent.
I guess, yeah, to answer the part about the James Lange, for those you're not familiar with it, it's sort of the perspective that, well, I won't say completely, but at least part of what goes into our feeling emotion is interpreting our bodily states. I guess that would be, but I think that hopefully the questioner kind of meant that. And I think there's some data that support that. We are aware, whether we realize it or not. I read a study recently where items that were presented in a recognition, just with words, it wasn't emotion, but if you got a distractor item, but it was presented congruent with your heartbeat, you were more likely to false alarm to that. then it was incongruent with your heartbeat. So you're at some level even aware of your heart rhythm. And there's some pretty decent research that suggests that part of what goes into this is the bodily reaction. That came up earlier in the conference about adding body as potential into our quartet.
Yeah, if I just make a comment, sorry, I don't want to talk too much. So actually the James Lange theory is a kind of founding theory for huge body of evidence supporting emotion as an embodied cognition. So emotion is very much embodied. That's a very much kind of founded on that theory. And even in the context of music, okay, if I advertise our own research, a few years back, we showed that when you listen to highly arousing music, then the degree of connections between heart and the brain increased quite substantially, because there are certain ways, if you measure both the brain response and the heart response, and through some signal processing, you can compute what are the degree of connection or information exchange between the heart and the brain. And that's going on continuously. And that we found that when we listen to a highly stimulating music, this degree of heart-brain coupling gets enhanced as compared to when you listen to low arousal music.
So fantastic. I have one more question. Trying to understand the role of emotion in music-evoked autobiographical memory, how to assess whether the self-reported emotional experience at memory retrieval is due to emotion with aesthetic response to emotion or associated with the memory.
That's like a question for Andrea.
Yeah, Andrea and you. I could hear aesthetics and autobiographical. Andrea?
I'm just rereading the question here, make sure I get it right. I'm okay. I'm not an expert, and I have one paper on musical autobiographical memory, and I was sort of the not the expert exactly on most of these topics, but it is actually a complicated question, because if we go back to our boat about self-report. So autobiographical memory is very tricky because it's one of the areas of memory where we cannot assess accuracy in most cases. We can only assess the qualitative aspects, like how vivid you think it is, et cetera, et cetera. So it's sort of doubly vulnerable to some of these self-report issues that we had been talking about earlier. And it is true that the point of I think there are two different things. One is an autobiographical memory triggered by the music. What I was studying was autobiographical memories of music. And again, so I think we also want to separate out those things. When people, though, who report the autobiographical memories triggered by music, again, I'm not an expert, but a lot of that emotion tends to be the memory itself, rather than the music can be quite incidental. Darling, they're playing our tune. The tune can be something very banal, but it's associated with us, darling. And so people tend to attribute, on average, I'm generalizing a great deal, the emotion more to the memory rather than the music, which can be quite incidental in some cases. Of course, not always. Naturally. So people, when they hear the hymn Abide With Me, it's sung at funerals, and those are intrinsically, and the words themselves, of course, have emotion to them as well. So that would be a counterexample.
So Marcus, you want to comment on this, or?
I'm not sure I have much to add to what Andrew said, actually.
Yeah, if I may just add 1-2 sentences, okay, I will back up the self-report part. If you remember in the morning, Stefan showed that in his meta-analysis, that the musical emotions activated not just nucleus accumbens, but also anterior hippocampus. And across all other rewarding stimuli, music is one of them, none consistently activated anterior hippocampus. We can feel pleasure rewarded by very many different ways. Music is one. However, music is one stimuli which consistently activates not just the traditional rewarding circuitry, but also anterior hippocampus. So that possibly might, okay, again, this is correlational evidence. These are not causational. That's what Andrea says. Okay, whether an autobiographical memory causing particular emotions or the other way around, that cannot say, but at least it tells us that naturally the music is possibly some extent goes hand in hand, the music and emotions and or kind of memory network related or experiencing kind of strong emotions, which is not found in the same degree for other biologically rewarding stimuli in the same way music does.
If the correct control conditions are done in the same study, which is rare. And I will offer anyone looking for a good control condition.
Sure.
We ended up using, and also in a great paper that Séverine Samson did, where she at first found music making seemed to help persons with dementia, but she didn't have a control condition. So she reran it and included cooking together as a active control condition. And guess what? They both acted the same. Music was not unique. And in ours, memories of music at first seemed to be kind of more vivid, etc. And then we added 2 control conditions after extensive pilot testing. We settled on memories of holidays and celebrations and memories of memorable meals and dining. Once again, food comes up, and those all acted the same. So if you're looking for a control condition, I look at food. That seems to be...
No, you're absolutely right. So, but the point is here, so when we experience reward or pleasure, memory network is not necessarily activated. For the music is possibly activated more than other rewarding stimulus. So let's put it like that. So that doesn't make it a special, that's what you're addressing, but it tells you that memory network, which is more likely to be reactivated, there again, should be careful about reverse inferencing. Their activation of hippocampus might play other role as well, rather than just an activation of memory traces.
Yes, so for future research. So I think we've been asked to wrap up. We are staying exactly to time. That's so amazing. And I don't know if Amelia would like to come on camera, but I thank my fellow panelists. Sorry that Stefan could not join us. I think, again, with permission of all the oral speakers, the talks will be on YouTube, which I guess we can push out to perhaps all the attendees. Not all attendees got links, but I'm sure we can push that out when you give us the word, Amir. And I want to thank all of you for cleaning the wall behind you, or whatever it is that you were doing, and putting on a fresh shirt if that's what you were doing. And for all our attendees and for our poster presenters, I read all the posters, even though I could only visit a few in the room. Very nice collection of work, and thank you so much for thinking of this, Amir. That was your brainchild, and I thank you for that.
Also, thanks to you, Andrea, as well as to Amir and all the other organizers and everyone involved.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I have a few slides that I would like to show.
And Amir, do you have some closing instructions?
Yes. So not instruction, but yeah, a few slides.